You to sign a visitor's book in the entryway, and whether it's your first visit or your 100th, we are glad that you came. I have a few announcements to share with you today. Please wear a mask. Masks are available for anyone who forgot one. We aren't able to sing in unison yet, but humming, dancing, swaying, and other expressions are strongly encouraged. And childcare will be provided this morning by Nancy Reed. We will be collecting the cards for joys and sorrows after our first hymn. Please fill them out or type into the chat box on Zoom if you have something you would like to share. Are there any other announcements for the good of the community?
Oh, I have one, Kevin. Speaking of hymns and dancing and moving and swaying with the music, we have a very rhythmic hymn for the last one today. So I brought a whole selection of rhythm instruments, and when there's any time you want to go find one of those to use on the last hymn or at the beginning of the hymn, that'll be great. We'll have ourselves a great band for the last music.
Thanks, Bill. As we prepare to be fully together, I remind you to silence your phones and devices. We now enter a space of worship. I invite you to join with me in our chalice lighting words as the flame is lit. If you don't know them by heart, they're number 448 at the back of the gray hymnal. We gather this hour as people of faith, with joys and sorrows, gifts and needs. We light this beacon of hope, sign of our quest for truth and meaning, in celebration of the life we share together.
Good morning.
Good morning.
It's so good to be with you today. And maybe you've noticed from the title of our service today, I promise you, this is a PG service, but we will acknowledge that sex is a thing that exists. So let's get right into it. So I want to tell you about the first time that I found out that sex was a thing that exists. And it was to win an argument, which if you know me well or have, I don't know, been married to me ever, you probably aren't surprised about a whole lot. I was maybe 6 or 7 years old, and my friend from daycare, let's call her Stacy, had a sister who had just had a baby. And Stacy was very proud of her new little niece and talked about her all the time. And so she told me offhand, as we were playing at daycare, that her niece didn't have a dad. She just had a mom. And even though she insisted it was true, I didn't believe that was possible. Ignorant though I was, I did love research. And so where a normal kid might ask their parents for more information, not me, I went to the library with the confidence that was entirely unearned and undeserved. I strode up to the librarian's desk and I told her, I need to know how babies are made. And bless her heart, she led me to an age-appropriate picture book on the mechanics of procreative sex, which I swear to you, I brought with me to daycare the following day to really hammer home my correctness. And much to my surprise, it did not resolve the argument, but escalated it. So much so that our daycare provider had to step in and break things up, and was very taken aback to discover the source of our disagreement. Bless her heart, she set me straight right away. She said, yes, two people are part of making a baby, but not every family has two parents participating in it. Some have one, some have two, some have more than two. They're all okay. But what you need to do is look at your friend. You're hurting her feelings. It's not all right to argue with someone about what their own family, what their own life looks like. And I think that's why we come to church, because we need to talk about sex and we need to talk about boundaries. And here we're going to do both today. I'm glad you're here. I'm glad to be with you. I ask you to rise in body or in spirit and to join with me in humming to, clapping, dancing, swaying to our opening hymn number 1029 in your teal hymnal.
Love knocks and waits for us to hear, to open and invite. Love longs to quiet every fear and seeks to set things right. Love offers life in spite of foes who threaten and condemn. Embracing enemies, love goes the second mile with them. Love comes to heal the broken heart, to ease the troubled mind. Without a word, love bids us start to ask and seek and find. Love knocks and enters at the sound of welcome from within. Love sings and dances all around and feels new life begin.
We are a community that holds one another in our joys and in our sorrows, in our celebrations and in our pains. We say to one another, we are with you. And so I invite you now, if you have joys or sorrows in your heart this morning, to find the paper that is tucked into your hymnal, or to use the chat box if you're joining us on Zoom, and share those biggest joys and sorrows that might be sitting with you this morning. Now it's time for a story. Our story this morning comes from a folk tale from West Africa called How the Crab Lost His Head. And this is a story about a crab who did not know how to say no, and about all of his friends who did not know how to ask kindly. And so it goes like this. The crab used to be one of the kindest, most friendly, and wealthiest of creatures, but he did not know how to say no. And his friends did not know how to ask kindly. So one day, Sansi, the snake, came up to the crab and said, "You have a nice home. I'll be taking that." And while the crab stammered and couldn't think of an answer, off Sansi went with the crab's home, and crab had to live in his shell. Goldfish came along and said, "Look at all of your beautiful gold and jewelry. You wouldn't mind if I took them, right?" And before crab could answer, goldfish swam off with all of his gold and jewels. Pangolin wandered by and saw a crab wrapped in a blanket without a home. He was cold, and Pangolin said, "Could I have that blanket? It looks so warm and fuzzy. Please, 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 please." And Pangolin would not stop begging until crab said, "Oh, fine." And then Pangolin wandered off with crab's blanket. The other animals came and went, doing the same thing, took even the clothes from crab's back until he sat on the beach alone. And then up came Anansi, the spider, the trickster. And Anansi said, "Yeah, Anansi's in so many stories, Elliot." And then Anansi said, "That's an awfully nice head you have, crab. I'm sure you don't need it, do you? You wouldn't mind if I took it?" And before crab could even answer, Anansi took crab's head and off he went. And there poor headless crab sat on the beach. And the creator of all things felt so sorry for crab that he fashioned some eyes on 2 sticks and poked them into crab's shell, which is why today we see that crabs have eyes that look like they're on 2 sticks. And that is the story of poor crab who could not say no, and all of his friends who could not ask kindly. And that is the end of our story this morning.
Now is the time in our service to join together in the spiritual practice of generosity. Our gifts support our church in its work. That work is summarized in our covenant. The covenant for UUCC says, "In service of the values that unite us, we will recognize the inherent value of each person, foster a community of compassion and caring for all, value our diverse opinions, and engage respectfully in all interactions." 1/4 of our plate collection for the frozen season goes to Metro Justice, an organization that seeks a better, more just world, free of economic, racial, and social injustice. You can give to this morning's offering by placing cash or a check into the basket, or if you are joining us from home, by visiting canandaigua.org/connection/donate, or mailing a check to UUCC at 3024 Cooley Road, Canandaigua 14424. In either case, make a note that your gift is intended for today's offering. We now gratefully accept the offering.
We hold many joys and sorrows in our hearts this morning. We sit with Carrie in her sorrow around her son David and his accident. He fell on the ice skating rink and needs many dental repairs, and our hearts go out to David and to Carrie. We hold sorrow with Jim Reed and so many of us remembering our friend Sam Hall. We celebrate along with Gigi, whose grandson celebrated a first birthday yesterday, and share in Scobie's joy at the beauty of birds on the beach. And we share with Hazel's joy, which is her love of being here. For all these joys and sorrows, and for those left in the silence of our hearts, I will drop a stone in the water this morning. And then we invite you, if you are a child and you would like to join Nancy downstairs for some play in the big religious education room, you can head that way now.
Go now in peace, go now in peace. May the love of all surround you everywhere, everywhere you may
I invite you now into a time of centering and meditation, followed by shared silence. Remembering, of course, that by silence, we mean the absence of grown-ups talking so that we can listen more closely to the sounds of life, the birds in the cars and the wind outside, the breath of our neighbor, the wiggles and giggles of our children nearby. So let's take a deep breath, get comfortable where you sit. Maybe let your eyes fall closed. I show up and there's always coffee ready. How, I do not know. Not leftover early morning coffee, now cold and burnt in the pot, but good, fresh coffee in its French press wrapped in a soft towel to stay warm, that I know she brewed with the same tender care with which she brews her every word. Come on in, she'll invite. There's coffee ready if you want it. Heavy cream will sit in a little metal pitcher beside a jar of turbinado sugar. Sweet delicacies of one kind or another will inevitably adorn the little kitchen table. Hallowed offerings when just a sip of water would do. There's always coffee ready. How, I do not know. She would tell you deferentially, she just drinks too much coffee. It's always freshly made. She eats too many sweets, they're always around. But I know better. I know she lives out her devotion to a love that encircles us all in its wide embrace by doing the same. I know she has knitted together a life of radical invitation with those gentle hands. I know her most fervent prayer to the love that leaves no one out, the love that knocks and waits for us to answer, is come on in. There's coffee ready if you want it. So Reverend Sherry from First Unitarian in Rochester mentioned in a recent meeting that around Valentine's Day, she likes to give I need you to know I'm quoting her here, an annual sex sermon. We should talk about sex in church at least once a year, she explained. Only she was in a predicament because she was supposed to be off that week. And the annual sex sermon seemed like maybe an unfair thing to assign to someone else, especially her brand new associate minister. So I play a chaotic good character in both Dungeons and Dragons and in real life. And before I knew what was what, I found myself volunteering for the sex sermon at our neighbor church, and why not, popping one on our worship calendar as well. So here I am preaching an apparently traditional sex sermon with, I'll be perfectly honest, zero context as to what it should entail. Now, I still don't know how Reverend Sherry's sermons go because your girl, the Chaos Goblin, literally did not think to ask. But buckle up for one this morning that is decidedly unsexy, which is fine. I really do not think the sexy content is the reason we come to church. So let's talk about consent, baby. There's no doubt we've come a long way when it comes to talking about consent. Just a generation or two ago, it was the actual honest to God law in most places that consenting to marriage meant a woman gave her permanent consent to any type of sex at any time. And now most of us, pretty sure that's not the case. Consent is even sometimes part of our children's sexual education. Progress. But usually our conception of consent is a yes or no answer to a single question about one narrow type of sex. We as a society are at like the middle school note passing maturity level here. Sex, check yes or no. And believe it or not, I think we can do better. Incredible professionals across our movement are setting our kids up to do better in OWL, our whole lives comprehensive sexuality education. And I think we grownups can manage it too. So I want to tell you, and this seems like a real divergence from the topic of annual sex sermon, but I promise it's not. I want to tell you about the rules we have at our home for our children's play. Our two kids are ages 2 and 5, and mostly they have 3 rules for playing together. 1, ask permission. 2, wait to hear a yes. 3, notice that everyone is enjoying themselves. So you see where I'm going, in that these are also the foundation of sexual consent. These children's rules are somehow a more explicit lesson in good sex than the poster in my college dormitory hallway that simply said, consent is sexy. No context, no elaboration. They're somehow a much more in-depth lesson than the sum total of 0 lessons on consent I received during my school sexual education. And I was more lucky than most American kids my age in that I got an education in the mechanics of sex, straight sex, and if I'm being honest, a pretty narrow version of it. But I did not get an education in the mechanics of how to ask for and agree to sex. And it's not that my partner and I value our kids' potential future sexual relationships so highly that we've embedded these lessons on sexual ethics in their play. We do value them, but that's not the reason for these rules. It's that consent, particularly this kind of clear, mutual, enthusiastic consent, is the foundation of all healthy relationships. On the playground and in the bedroom and in the workplace and the doctor's office and the school and the church, joyful, mutual consent is the framework for loving one another well. Okay, so back to kid rule number 1, ask permission. Meaning we ask permission before and during interactions. We ask in open-ended, non-coercive ways. Do you feel like playing with puzzles right now? Yeah, how about the train puzzle? Oh, you don't want the train puzzle? How about one of these others? You can choose. And we ask as we go along. Would you like to start with the corner pieces? That's how I like to do puzzles. In the context of sex, it sounds more like, here's what I like. Do you want to try it? And hey, how would you feel about such and such? I'm going to trust you to fill in all the details on such and such. And in the context of church, it might be something like, I've got a cool story. Do you want to hear it? Or I think you'd be great on the stewardship team. Are you interested? We ask permission whenever we enter someone else's body bubble. So we want our kids to check in before touching or coming too close to another person's body. Hey, do you want a hug before bed? Can we cuddle while we read this book? Hey, brother, do you want to play indoor tag and drive our parents crazy? Cool. I would like it noted, I have never once consented to indoor tag. Outside of childhood play, we should be checking in before we enter someone's physical space as well, in small platonic ways, like, is it okay if I sit beside you? Are you comfortable with me taking off my mask now that we're outside? As well as, and long before, asking permission to enter someone's physical bubble in a sexual way. And we ask permission when we enter someone's emotional bubble too. Admittedly, this is harder to figure out. I'm a whole ass adult and I'm still working on it. But it can sound something like, do you want to talk about this right now, or do you need some more time before you're ready? Do you mind if I tell Reverend Eileen what you're going through? I see that you're upset. Do you want me to try and help, or do you need to be left alone? I want to watch a Star Wars. Is that going to be too scary for you? Or, wow, thanks for sharing that hard thing. Is it okay if I ask you some questions about it? When we ask permission like this, when we do the work of mutual boundary setting, we are creating holy space around us and between us. This space that's made by the invitation to participate in consent is a space that honors our particularity as humans. It acknowledges that we are particular and unique persons with particular gifts and particular needs, and that we know that our own gifts and needs are not universal, that they belong to us and to no one else. While we are interwoven, interdependent, we are not one being. And asking permission marks the holy space of that bubble around ourselves, our bodies, and our feelings. It marks the holiness of the space between us. Okay, so the second kids rule that's really for everyone. Wait to hear a yes. When we're building mutual consent, we're not waiting to hear the, I'll go along with whatever you want of codependency, because that dishonors the particularity of a person. We're not waiting to hear the half-hearted, I guess that would be okay, that comes from someone who's unsure they can claim their own holy space. Or the okay, fine, that comes from a person who's being coerced, whose emotional space has already been violated. We're waiting for a clear and certain yes that arises from the holy space within a person who knows their own gifts and needs, who values them in such a way that they can set a boundary. The boundaries we lay down, separating my needs from your needs, my desires from your desires, my agency from your agency, are holy indeed. That space that a boundary delineates between us honors us as distinctive, differentiated persons. The blessing of a boundary is to say, this is where I end and you begin. But it's becoming easy to see how these seemingly simple rules actually are to adhere to in a real relationship, in a family, in a community, right? From the earliest age, we need practice, because it doesn't come naturally to us in the context of the dominant culture here to relate to one another in this way. Even if it isn't necessarily your culture personally, if you're here this morning, I think it's safe to say you're pretty steeped in white middle-class culture, which is to say the culture of colonialism and white supremacy. If you live in this country, it's pretty impossible to avoid its impact. And one of its impacts is indirect communication, making assumptions instead of asking and waiting. One of its impacts is reinforcement of power and control, a hesitancy to ask for what we want if we don't feel powerful enough, and an urge to just take it if we do. A hard time saying no to power, which means a hard time listening to a clear yes from others and ourselves. One of its impacts is a consumerism that runs so deep that we start to conceive of one another's bodies and attention and time as objects for our consumption. One of its impacts is disembodiment, a disconnection with our own bodies to the extent that we have trouble sustaining that imagined body bubble that tells us where we end and another person begins. A disconnection so deep that we sometimes aren't sure what to ask for to give our bodies joy and whether what we're feeling in response is a yes or a no. And here we get to the good part, which is also, I'm so sorry, the hardest part. Rule number 3, notice that everyone is enjoying themselves. The first 2 rules, wait, ask, and wait for an answer. We might need practice, but their existence as rules makes sense, yes? When I include them in consent building, I'm pretty much preaching to the choir here. But number 3, in a culture that's inevitably impacted by colonialism and white supremacy, in a church that's inherited from Puritans, is so often left out altogether. Maybe we just take a moment and revel in the absurdity of leaving the joy out of consent. Because if there's anything that makes human sexuality and human play fundamentally human, it's enjoyment, pleasure, delight. So if you take nothing else away from the annual sex sermon this year, let it be this: you were made for joy. Part of the purpose of this 3rd rule in play is to remind my children that consent is fluid. It's ongoing. It's not a check yes or no and move on process, but something they should be aware of coming back to again and again. And joy should be the guide. This thing I agreed to a while ago, is it still bringing me joy? That thing my brother usually loves to do together, does it seem like he's enjoying it right now? And we can ask ourselves the same questions in all our relations. Is there joy in the space between us? Do I experience pleasure as a result of this interaction, this work, this conversation? And does it seem like these beloved humans on the other side of the holy space between us are delighting as well? I need you to know that what I do not mean is that we are never uncomfortable, uncertain, pushed to our growing edges, or held accountable in our relationships. Do we need to be thrilled about every choice our partners, our playmates, our fellow congregants make? Hell no. What Rule 3 means is that our own choices are guided by joy, not the absence of discomfort, which can masquerade as joy, but from that deep and steady reservoir of joy that bubbles up when you are your truest self. And that we allow space for beloved others to ask and answer from that deep joy as well. And wow, is that hard from within a cultural framework that tells us most pleasure, especially sexual pleasure, is a sin. Like, it sounds really simple. Notice that everyone is enjoying themselves, but we cannot spend a lifetime being told sex is not for you to enjoy and then just casually take note of our embodied joy. This one, my friends, takes some doing, or probably more accurately, some undoing. We will need to undo the hooks that the dominant culture has sunk into our hearts, telling us that delight in our bodies is somehow wrong. We will have to practice being awake and aware of our bodies, feeling our feelings inside our bodies. Once, years ago, my therapist asked me to scan my body and notice where my anxiety was showing up that day. And I said, I don't really think about feelings being in my body. She leaned forward studiously like a good therapist. And she said, "Where else would they be? Where else would they be?" Shit. To follow rule number 3, which children are actually pretty good at until we teach them not to be, we will have to be okay with noticing our bodies. We cannot notice enjoyment without them, because where else would it be? Consent building is vital to our sexual relationships and to our community relationships. As Unitarian Universalists, we structure our communities around covenants, around a holy question and answer, an invitation to consent. Can we make these promises to one another? We ask. Can we say yes to these ways of loving one another well? Will we find joy if we do? And it's not just some coincidence that this practice of asking and waiting for an answer happens to be good for us sexually and playfully and congregationally, all for separate reasons. It's that in all its forms, this is what love looks like. Because love may leave no one out, but it does not force its way in. This is how loving relations work. When we relate to one another as humans with love as the medium for our relations, as the holy space between us, that looks like consent. So let us, in all our relating, make the invitation, wait for an answer, and notice joy. May it be so. Amen.
Tell me what makes you weary. Tell me what lights up your eyes. I'll meet you there in the middle. We'll lay down and harmonize. Tell me what makes you peaceful. Tell me what you fantasize. I'm taking notes in the moonlight. We'll lay down and harmonize. We'll lay down and harmonize. I'm awake for you. I'm awake for you. Tell me what keeps you honest. Tell me what keeps you inspired. I'll always come in the morning. We'll lay down and harmonize. Tell me what moves you ready. Tell me what moves your insides. I'll bring the soul, bring the steady. We'll lay down and harmonize. We'll lay down and harmonize. I'm awake for you. I'm awake for you. I'm awake for you. I'm awake for you.
May we be so awake to that well of joy within us that we can ask for what we desire and answer in truth. I invite you now to rise in body or in spirit, to grab an instrument if you'd like one, and to join us in playing, dancing, swaying, or humming to our closing hymn number 311 in the gray hymnal, Let It Be a Dance.
Let it be a dance we do. May I have this dance with you through the good times and the bad times too. Let it be a dance. Let a dancing song be heard. Play the music, say the word, and fill the sky with sailing birds. Let it be a dance. Let it be a dance. Let it be a dance. Learn to follow, learn to lead. Feel the rhythm, feel the need. To reap the harvest, plant the seed. Let it be a dance. Let it be a dance we do. May I have this dance with you through the good times and the bad times too. Let it be a dance. Everybody turn and spin. Let your body learn to dance and feel like a with the wind. Let it be a dance. Let it be a dance. Let it be a dance. A child is born, the old must die. A time to joy and time to cry. Take it as it passes by. Let it be a dance. Let it be a dance we do. May I have this dance with you through the good times and the bad times too. Let it be a dance. Star comes out at night. Without the dark there is no light. If nothing's wrong, then nothing's right. Let it be a dance. Let it be a dance. Let it be a dance. Let the sunshine let it rain. Better than to bear the pain. And round we'll go again. Let it be a dance. Last time, let it be a dance we do. May I have this dance with you through the good times and the bad times too. Let it be a dance.
Please join me in our words for extinguishing the chalice. If you don't know them by heart, they can be found at 456 at the back of the gray hymnal. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.